Okay, folks, we're going to cover really quickly all of the concepts that we did in Unit 2 in preparation for our test. So we're covering Unit 2 of our general topic, polynomial and quadratic expressions, equations, and functions. The first thing we did in this unit was actually a review of factoring quadratic expressions. So we made sure that we were kind of in mastery mode of factoring quadratic expressions both for a equals 1 and a does not equal 1. We have several methods, and I made a screencast available for that one. If you think that you still need to review that, go back and take a look, because you don't want to lose time on the test working on kind of this prerequisite concept. Our first class then, in getting into Unit 2, was graphing quadratics from factored form. So we were graphing from intercept form, obviously finding the x-intercepts and being able to decipher where the vertex was from there. We applied the concept of symmetry. That was the one where we did that problem where we found 2 points directly across from each other on different sides of the parabola. And those were not the x-intercepts, it was 2 other points. And then we were able to work backwards. Given the graph, obviously we had the x-intercepts, we were able to develop the factors of the quadratic and then FOIL those out, or use the distributive property to multiply those out and ultimately get back to the quadratic equation. That was really cool. Class 2, interpreting quadratic functions from graphs and tables. This was the class where we watched the dolphin video, if you remember that. And we were able to apply the concept of quadratic, the graphs and the information that comes from the quadratic function. We put that in table form when we were watching the dolphin video. Beyond that, we identified all the parts and pieces of a quadratic function in terms of as it relates to graphs. And so we looked at things like the minimum or the maximum, in other words, finding the vertex. We looked at symmetry with relation to the axis of symmetry. We looked at increasing and decreasing intervals and things like that. We did lots of application problems. So those are definitely notes that you'd like to go back and take a look at. Our third class was the introduction, your first shot at completing the square. We focused on quadratics that had a equals 1. So we didn't do any of the hard ones where we had to pull that a out before we could complete the square. We talked about what the point was of completing the square, how it's useful, and I made a screencast available to you if you needed extra help with that. The next class was when we got into the harder completing the square problems. That was when a does not equal 1, and so we had to go ahead and pull that a out from the a term and the b term before we could complete the square. Make sure you are able to do that. We also talked about what that means when we pull the coefficient out in front like that, and what that means about the graph. And if you recall, in this class we worked on a business application. Hint, hint, make sure you go back and take a look at that. There was also a screencast available that covered these. I think there were 4 problems covered these problems as well. Class number 5, we were solving quadratics by completing the square, so no longer were they just expressions, now they were equations. And so we talked about other ways of solving a quadratic, especially the ones that can't be factored or can't be factored nicely. This brought us to a conversation about irrational numbers and how we express the solution when there's a radical in the solution. So go ahead and take a look at that and make sure you know how to rationalize the denominator. There's a screencast. If you didn't look at it then, you might want to look at it now as a review for the test. In class 6, we derived the quadratic formula. We derived it from standard form. And then we went back and we actually used it to solve some of the equations that we had solved by completing the square, to convince ourselves that the quadratic formula actually works and we had derived it properly. And so we talked about when we would use the quadratic formula, and at this point we had several different methods now for solving a quadratic equation. So you can factor it, certainly you can graph it, you can complete the square, or you can use the quadratic formula. Make sure that you know the quadratic formula because it will not be given to you on the test. Using the quadratic formula brought us to a discussion of non-real solutions. That means that there was a negative under the radical sign. Make sure you know how to deal with that. And then we talked about how beautiful the discriminant is, that part of the quadratic formula that's under the radical sign, and what that tells us in terms of the number of solutions and whether or not they're real or non-real. Good job. Class 8, we were graphing quadratics from vertex form. So vertex form gave us the H, the K, and the A, and you have to know what each one of those does and be able to graph them. These were the ones that graphed really nicely, pretty easy to graph them, especially if you know and understand the nature of the parent function, which we went over, y equals x squared. So we kind of generalized and made our own rules in our own language about how A works. And so make sure that you can explain that in a way that makes sense. In class number 9, we were graphing quadratics from standard form. And again, we wanted to be able to just look at a quadratic equation or a quadratic function in standard form and identify as much about the graph as possible. Of course, seeing where the y-intercept is from standard form is super easy. Also, A is kind of standing right out there in open field, and so we know whether the graph is opening up or down, whether it's stretched or compressed, and so on. And then we talked about how non-real solutions translate graphically. In other words, if there are no solutions, obviously it doesn't cross the x-axis, and so those come up as negatives under the radical. All right, so that pretty much covers everything that we did for Unit 2, and we're looking at a test for our next class. Be sure to email me if you have any specific questions about what you should be studying or any specific questions about something you don't understand. All right, I will see you next class, and good luck on the test.